listen mostly to the chats of the larger group. Over this last year, we have had various different experiences in life, and we've learned various different lessons from the lockdown. And one of the things that we found ourselves over the past 10 months or so enforced into is a greater sense and kind of practical outworking, even if we didn't want to, of solitude than perhaps we are generally used to. So I wanted to just share some thoughts this afternoon on how to use solitude. It's a wonderful piece of divine synchronicity that on my Facebook memories, one of my Facebook memories that came up today was a post that I'd put up a year ago. I made a little statement in a side of picture. You can go and have a look on my Facebook page after I finish talking, obviously, about how to make sure that your aloneness is created into a sense of solitude rather than loneliness. So I wanted to talk about how to use solitude, how to kind of incorporate this enforced lifestyle that we're in at the moment, particularly if you live alone. And I don't know how many people know this, because the whole lockdown scenario has caused me to lose track of who might know. But for the past 8 months, I've lived on my own. So how do we actually use that positively, particularly when we're enforced into it? Personally, once I'd worked out some of the practicalities of making sure that I can make an income, because lots of my income is based on going out and leading retreats at retreat centers. Once I'd worked that out, I personally actually really enjoyed the extra solitude. I'm one of those strange combinations of people who is a contemplative extrovert. So I struggle to do personality tests of Myers-Briggs and Enneagram styles because I love my own company and I love other people's company, and I'm quite happy with long periods of both. But this idea of this kind of a national, sometimes global, enforced monastic lifestyle, how have people dealt with that? We'll have a chance to talk about that in small groups, in breakout groups in a little while. And I think it's caused a lot of people to realize that the practice of stillness and solitude is quite significant actually to our humanness, to our own selves. A lot of people have realized that having space and time is actually beneficial to them. However, you might be one of those people who struggle to spend time on their own, particularly any length of time, particularly if it's enforced on you. Just right at the beginning here, I'd like to flag up a couple of books that would help in this. One of them is this Postinia book. Some people may have seen it. It says on the front it's a modern spiritual classic, and I would agree with that, certainly is. It's a really good book on encountering God in silence, solitude, and prayer. Postinia is a Russian word from the Orthodox tradition that means desert, and that's by Catherine Doherty. And the other one is this one here called Solitude, A Neglected Path to God by Christopher Moore. That's also an excellent book on this, and actually I'm going to quote from that a little bit later on. For this session, what I want to do is to actually draw a few bits out of my upcoming book by BRF that's going to come out later this year, called The Art of Peace, Life Lessons from Christian Mystics. It's divided into 4 sections: stillness, silence, solitude, and sanctuary. So what I want to do is draw some bits out of the solitude section, which I've written in that, and looking quite heavily within that whole section. There's 3 chapters in each section, so 12 in the whole book. In that section, there's quite a lot on the desert tradition, which of course deeply informative towards Celtic monasticism in the early church that we study and we are inspired by. We'll split into breakout groups twice in that to talk about things related to that, and hopefully we will and be able to encourage each other to better use the times that we find ourselves in solitude. So this first section, we're going to do it in two halves. This first section is coming from the chapter in the book called Go to Your Cell. So in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus teaching his disciples on prayer, we find a very interesting starting place for Jesus' teaching. The first thing which Jesus teaches his disciples about prayer from the Matthew version of the teaching on prayer. So the first thing that we have in our New Testament from Jesus on prayer is to go to a quiet, solitary place and to use very few words. Matthew 6, verses 6 to 7. Jesus' first instruction to his disciples on prayer: go to a solitary place and use very few words, what we might term today as solitary contemplative prayer. Now, this isn't perhaps what most folk in our modern church often get taught as the first step of prayer, this solitary contemplative prayer. It may even be seen as a higher form of prayer, if there is such a thing, really only for those people who are already quite practiced and perhaps deeply spiritual. But this was Jesus' first instruction: solitude and silence, or at least very few words. Only then did he teach the formula, the structure for prayer, the Lord's Prayer as we call it, which we shared this morning in morning prayer. In desert monasticism, very beginnings of the monastic tradition, there is a famous statement, which is the title of this section, which reflects that teaching of Jesus. Just to quote one of the Desert Fathers' books that I've got, it says, "In Scetis, a brother went to Abba Moses and asked for advice on prayer. Abba Moses said to him, 'Go and sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything.'" The cell was the small domain in which every monk lived. Sometimes there were two monks in the cell, sharing a cell, literally having a cellmate. And these were just about big enough for a person to stand up in and lay down in fact, quite similar to the ones we can see behind Simon Lumby's head on Skellig Michael and various other places had these kind of little perhaps beehive huts is what the Celts had. Very similar sort of things. So Abba Moses was approached to give advice, which was part of what he was there for. He obviously saw in whoever was coming to him asking for prayer that the deepest need was just simply to follow Jesus' first instruction on prayer: go and sit in a solitary place in silence, and that will teach you everything you need to know. What you need to know, you will discover in solitude and silence. There's a saying, everything you need is within you. And this is true in the sense that the divine presence dwells within each of us, and that's all that we need. We just need to be still and quiet enough to hear that divine voice, similarly to what Penny was talking about this morning. It is that divine presence within us that we discover when we sit in silence and solitude. We discover it there. We find that everything that we need is within us. And this can lead us to some wondrous things and experiences. In the same period of Abba Moses, Jerome, who was the author of the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible, widely used across Western Christianity for hundreds of years, wrote of Amma Arcella and said that she enclosed herself in the narrow confines of a single cell, and there she enjoyed the wide pastures of paradise. Amma Arcella, he said, lived in silence and privacy, appearing discreetly in public only when she attended the Church of the Holy Martyrs. In silent solitude, she discovered the indwelling divine presence, which led her to be able to experience the wide pastures of paradise within herself and enclosed in the space that she was physically in. In the silence of solitude, we begin to discover and to hear the sound of silence through which the divine voice speaks, just like the prophet Elijah did up on the mountainside where a good translation of the still small voice is the sound of silence that Elijah heard the divine voice in. In the silence of solitude, we are able to let go of all the things that distract us and entangle us. We are able to let the thoughts of our minds drop away. We are able to be undistracted, to focus fully on the divine presence, something that external distractions often cause us to not be able to do. Solitude is to be alone with the divine and one's self. Each sister should be alone in her cell, Teresa of Avila says. For it's easier to keep silence if one is alone. And getting used to solitude is a great help in prayer. So what we're talking about is the practice which each of us can engage in, that some took as a lifestyle, but we can all take as a practice, and has perhaps been slightly more strongly foisted upon us over the last year. Christian history is full of the stories of solitary hermits who take themselves off to live in solitude and silence and engage with and encounter the divine through that practice. One such person is Kevin of Glendalough. He wanted to live a life of a solitary hermit, so he moved into a hollowed out tree in the Valley of Two Lakes, which is the meaning of Glendalough, in Ireland. So this followed the practice of the early desert fathers and mothers who went out from the growing urbanization into the quietness of the deserts. However, just as in the deserts, and they became the beginnings of monastic communities, people went out to visit the hermits in the deserts for spiritual direction and eventually stayed there. So Kevin began to gain these followers in Glendalough. And this became the monastic community that you can still go and visit today. However, Kevin still desired the solitude. So as the community began to grow, he upgraded from a hollow tree to the cave in the side of the cliff, which you can still see if you go there, but you can't get to it, overlooking one of the lakes. And then finally, there is the remains of a small stone cell up in the woods, overlooking the lakes, which you can still go to and discover, where perhaps is the place perhaps that Kevin stood, where the blackbird landed on his hand, in this hours and hours of solitary silence in his cell. Kevin's devotion to both silence and solitude, lengths of prayer, and also to creation means that the story goes that when he had his hand out of the window, resting on the windowsill of the cell, a blackbird landed in it and found this to be a beautiful place, quite warm, to build its nest. It built its nest, laid its eggs, hatched its eggs, and fledged the young. That's the story that came out. So perhaps we might think that's a bit unbelievable. Certainly Seamus Heaney in his poem, Kevin and the Blackbird, thinks it's all made up. But possibly not. I remember a few years ago, Ken McIntosh talking about this and mentioning an Indian guy called Sadhu Ama Bharati, who is an Indian guru who has decided, or who he did decide, to raise his hand in worship of Shiva, who is his chosen goddess, to worship Shiva by raising his hand in the air. And he did that in 1973, and he's still alive and he still hasn't taken it down. So you can see pictures of you do an internet search for Sadhu Amar Bharati. You can see him there, and some of his followers have had their hands up for the last 20 years as well. So perhaps if this guy has had his hand up in the air since 1973, almost 50 years, perhaps one season of a fledgling blackbird isn't quite as long as we think, especially if you've got a windowsill to rest your arm on. But it is a solitary stillness and quiet that we want to focus on with Kevin. Despite becoming one of the greatest remaining physical sites in the ancient Celtic monasticism still visible today, Kevin maintained the desire for solitary silence, knowing that it was a significant aspect of his own spiritual and personal growth. but also that without it, the growth of the community would suffer. The benefits of Kevin's own solitude were poured out into the community through his deep encounters with the divine. Another great hermit of a similar period, a bit later, was Guthlac, known as the Hermit of Crowland, who, as it says in the life of Guthlac, when he heard tell and learned concerning anchorites, who of yore longed for the wilderness and hermitages of God's name, and passed their lives there, his heart was inwardly inspired with love of God to long for the wilderness. Guthlac lived on a small island in the Fens in East Anglian Kingdom during the 8th century. And like many stories of these great early saints, the life of Guthlac is full of battles with demons and spiritual darkness and divine help from mostly Saint Bartholomew. It was his silence in solitude which enabled him the strength to battle these demons, be they real or inner demons. We can take encouragement from the life of Guthlac for our own lives, in that in the times of silent solitude, we can gain the strength from dwelling in the divine presence to become more than conquerors through him who loved us, as Paul says in Romans 8. More than conquerors through him who loved us over the spiritual darkness, in the spirit realms, as well as those perhaps in our inner demons, as they're called in psychology, that we each face all the time. There are many other hermits throughout Christian heritage who can inspire us, but it might not feel like something that you personally have a deep desire to do, to go and live as a solitary hermit. Your heart might not be inwardly inspired with the love of God to long for the wilderness like St. Guthlac's, especially perhaps over the past year where you've been forced to experience it. But perhaps there is a desire in you to take some time out for a short period, to have your own space. There's a growing desire in Western culture for solitude, for taking time out at least, if not becoming a full-time hermit. The desire to have one's own space is real, and I would say necessary, and it comes from a deeply primal part of our true being, who we are created to be. In the book Solitude and Neglected Path to God, Christopher Moore says, the use of the word space to denote a kind of personal psychological enclave has an interesting and revealing history. It first appeared in the English language in the mid-1300s and remained in common usage for 300 years until the mid-1600s, when it disappeared. As recently as 1983, the 9th edition of Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary listed 10 definitions of space, none of them denoting the psychological dimension. However, in the 10th edition, a new definition of space was added, which was the opportunity to assert or experience one's identity or needs freely. So why would a particular definition of a word, Christopher Moore says, obsolete for 300 years, suddenly reappear in the language? The answer is obvious, because the concept embodied by the usage of that word has once again become relevant to large numbers of people. It is in the concept of needing one's own space that we find an inchoate and unconscious longing for solitude. We feel the need for our own space on occasion. Perhaps not as a lifestyle, like solitary hermits, but at least to take time out to be alone, to go to our cell and experience the wide pastures of paradise which dwell within ourselves. This is different to taking a communal retreat. This is about our solitude, being intentionally alone. This is about being alone in the divine presence so as to hear the silence for ourselves. But how do we effectively use this solitude? Especially if it's more of an enforced situation rather than a chosen one. One way is to simply switch everything off in your own home, because that's generally where we are these days, which could cause distractions, such as your mobile phone, and just be in stillness and silence. As Rosemary said earlier, this is not wasting time. This is a good use of our time, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. But you may need to practice this to get used to it and to get over the guilt of I should be doing something useful. You may need to use some meditation techniques to get your thoughts to become still. But after a while, after some practice, the silence of solitude will become a home in which you can feel comfort and warmth. Another way to engage in this is to find solitary places outside in nature. Obviously at the moment, only within walking distance of your home, but in future, perhaps wider, further afield. This might take a bit more organizing and working out, because other people can be everywhere outside unless you have a good large outside space to yourself privately. But there are places that one can go to where you can engage in solitary silence. You might just need to do a bit of research into it, that's all. But engaging in intentional solitary silence in the natural world brings a whole new level of experience to your practice. Engaging with the actual creation, listening, as I did this morning in morning prayer, gazing, consider, and contemplating. It's my experience that as I have engaged in silence, solitude, in both of the ways above, at home in my own and a quiet outside space, that one's experience is different depending on where one engages in this practice. Trying more than one, perhaps you'll find even more examples. Think of more things, more places that you can go to dwell and be alone. Perhaps the mobile cell that we all have, the mobile little metal cell that we have that runs on wheels and petrol, that we can be alone in this space. Use that time wherever you're going, if you're driving somewhere, to dwell in that silence and solitude in the divine presence. So following the instructions and examples of the Desert Fathers and Mothers and the words of Christ, go to your cell, find a solitary space, be silent, or at least use very few words, and just be. And perhaps you might discover the beautiful pastures of paradise within you. I'm going to do a screen share now of a quote by Thomas Merton, and then I'm going to leave that up for a little while and then be ready to go off into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes from seeing that screen. So let me share the screen with you if I can find it on my list of screens. There we go. So just sit with this for a moment or two, and then be ready to be put into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. And then we'll come back together and I'll share some more thoughts. I have only one desire, and that is the desire for solitude, to disappear into God, to be submerged in his peace, to be lost in the secret of his face. Okay, so what you would have noticed there is you didn't quite get put into breakout rooms. It didn't really work like I wanted, because what I actually wanted to do was for Simon to put us into breakout rooms and everybody to find themselves in a breakout room of just themselves, where we're all suddenly enforced into our own solitude. But apparently you can't do that when we've got this many people. So I just had to tell you that we were going to be into breakout rooms and then just not do it for you. So you suddenly found yourself 10 minutes on your own. And perhaps just pause for a moment, think how you felt. Remember that, so that at the end, where we have an open time together, we can talk about that as well. The sense of just suddenly being on your own for those 10 minutes, no sound other than what's around you, just a little thing to contemplate on, just a little phrase, just a few lines from Thomas Merton. So our second section, putting this into two chunks, I've entitled The Desert of Your Heart, which is also the title of the chapter of this part of the book. In the early centuries of Christianity, there was what might be called today a movement. It began during the persecutions in the 3rd century and continued through the early years of the legalization of Christianity by the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. This movement was of men and women moving out of the cities and into the deserts in the Middle East and Egypt to be solitary hermits, to live whole, holistic lives for God. These people became known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and we met a couple of them in the last little section of the talk. Some of the Desert Fathers and Mothers moved out into the desert to escape the persecution of Christians. But then after Christianity was legalized across the Roman Empire, some moved out into the desert to live a more authentic life dedicated to the divine. After Constantine legalized Christianity, he began to give concessions to priests with regards to taxes and houses and other things, which caused a number of people to start to become priests simply because of those benefits, not because of an interest in the Christian faith. The state church began to develop, became much more political than spiritual. And many people, especially those who had stood firm during the persecutions, found this unacceptable and so moved out of the cities, and the growing institutionalization and sanitization of the church into the deserts, into solitude, to live in greater austerity and dedication to their faith. These individuals soon began to gather others around them, and this became the beginnings of monasticism. The reason that these individuals drew others to them was because of their holiness and their teaching. There's a good amount of their teaching and life examples available to us. The sayings and lives of the Desert Fathers and Mothers have become infamous and deeply directional all through the ages. Desert monasticism is thought to be the main influence on Celtic monasticism, which was the basis of how Celtic Christianity worked and expressed itself. One of the differences between Celtic Christianity and the Latin Christianity and the rest of the mainland. The writer and theologian St. John Cassian wrote 2 great volumes of teachings on the ways of the desert monastics. And it's felt that it was he who brought Western Christianity, desert monasticism, through the 4th and 5th centuries. So this would mean that Cassian was arguably one of the greatest influences on Celtic monasticism as it formed and expressed. Also a great influence on the whole of the contemplative tradition of the Western Church. And Martin of Tours, we know, also was a great influence on bringing desert monasticism into Western Christianity. And desert monasticism is a huge part of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the spiritual life guidance of their book, the Philokalia. We expanded on one single statement in our last session, the go to your cell and your cell will teach you everything. Now I want to look at just a few more through which we might be able to better navigate and live in the desert of our heart, or the how to live effectively in solitude, our own inner place of being more authentic and devoted in our faith to the divine. As we step into a few sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, it's worth a small introduction. Thomas Merton, who you just spent some time with a quote on, taught and wrote a lot about desert monasticism. And he says that the Desert Fathers and Mothers were, in a certain sense, anarchists. And it would do us no harm to think of them in that way. They were people who did not believe in letting themselves be passively guided and ruled by a decadent state, and who believed that there was a way of getting along without slavish dependence on accepted conventional values. They were humble, quiet, sensible people with a deep knowledge of human nature and enough understanding of the things of God to realize that they knew very little about him. In her book on the Forgotten Desert Mothers, Laura Swan says, desert ascetics cultivated a heart engaged in intense listening. Listening for the beloved's voice cultivated a wise and compassionate heart, able to yield to the movements of the Holy Spirit. Listening to the ebbs and flows of the Spirit was fundamental to a life of discernment. A still, focused attention was needed for fruitful discernment. True discernment does not presuppose how the Spirit will move, nor what God will say. In this life of cultivated listening, these desert ascetics were open to the unexpected. They were willing to be surprised by God. That's a good book to get, The Forgotten Desert Mothers by Laura Swan. So what have these ancient men and women from the first few centuries got to teach us in our modern lives? What have these first Christian mystics got in their wisdom, which will help us when we enter the desert of our heart in this season of solitude that we find ourselves in at the moment? What I want to do is to go now into breakout rooms again for about 20 minutes. And I'm going to paste some quotes from the Desert Fathers and Mothers into the chat box for everybody, so that when you're in, you actually are going to go into breakout rooms this time, like before. So when you're in the breakout rooms, you'll have you'll be able to go into the chat box section and have that there next to you and have those quotes. So read through the quotes and then talk about them together and discuss them and what you think about them. But first, a final word on this section, the shorter section on the desert of our heart. All the ontology of desert monasticism can be embodied in our own journey as we retreat to the desert of our heart. Not many of us will feel called to physically find a place to live in solitude like the Desert Fathers and Mothers. Not many of us will feel the call to disconnect physically with the societal culture into which we are so intrinsically interwoven. But many of us will indeed feel a draw to disconnect with it occasionally. And currently, as we are enforced into that, and so we can draw into our own hearts. We can withdraw into our own hearts, into our own inner being, in the same way that those of the ancient times withdrew physically into the deserts. Our inner being, the very core of ourselves, our heart, is a place which needs the cultivation of the silence of the desert, the intense listening. Through this occasional withdrawal into the desert of our heart, we do not presuppose how the Spirit will move, nor what God will say. But in this life of cultivated listening, we are open to the unexpected. We are willing to be surprised by God, just a rephrasing of Laura Swan's quote from her book. In the desert of our heart, we encounter a more transcendent reality, just as the Desert Fathers and Mothers did. And this reality, the divine reality, enables us to better overcome temptations and darkness, which we may encounter in our normal everyday lives, especially at this time. It is in the presence of the divine where we find light and love, where we can overcome the sense of darkness and sadness. when we cannot. For you. So the three monks, there were once three friends who decided to become monks. One of them decided that he would follow Matthew 5 verse 9 and endeavor to make peace among people. The second decided that he would follow Matthew 25 verse 34 to 40 and endeavor to heal the sick and feed the hungry. The third decided that he would follow Luke 5 verse 16 and go into the desert to be silent. After a time, the first monk found that he became despondent in his heart, as he was unable to settle all quarrels, and many people would not listen to him, and some did not even want peace. So he went to the one who was tending the sick and the poor. He found that this monk too was despondent in his heart, as he was unable to make much difference to the great need. So the two of them decided to go to the one in the desert who sat in silence. When they got to him, they asked how he was doing in his calling. The third monk sat silent for a while and then poured a jug of water into a large bowl. "Look into the water," he said. They looked in and could not really see clearly, as the water was still disturbed and agitated, not yet settled. They sat back down, waiting. The three sat in silence and stillness for a while. And finally, the monk who had poured the water into the bowl said to them again, "Look again into the water." So the two of them did so, and this time they saw clearly their own reflections. They sat back down and looked at the monk who had poured the water, who looked up to them and said, "So it is with each of us. We must become still and quiet for us to clearly see our true selves, and thus then only know what we are called to do in the divine image." There you go. It's one of the stories from the Desert Fathers there. So let me just click back on, oh no, I'm going to stay on speaker view. Just an opportunity if folks are able to unmute themselves. We are all in a place where our solitude has become greatly increased, whether that's within our own home because we live on our own, or whether it's with our families because we're all in our own home. But our sense of solitude, or our practice of solitude, has become greatly increased. So I would really encourage you to use it beneficially, to intentionally use the solitude rather than getting disappointed or despondent or depressed or wound up at home. Actually to use that, to have a sense of connection with the divine. And like we were saying earlier on, that sense of connection with the divine enables us to have a greater connection with other people and other things, gives us a greater connection of with creation as well. And one of the things that I found through the long time practice of this deeper connection with the divine to connect me with others is that actually I now never feel alone, because I feel like other people are with me. I feel like the natural world around me is connected with me. So I never feel alone because I'm always surrounded with something or some conscious awareness of other people. Okay, I think that's me done, Simon.